Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation and last and final part to When One Thing Ends, Another Can Begin. This will be Chapter 8, entitled Finish the Chapter, Turn the Page, and Start Another. Izuku walked through the school gates, making his way down the familiar route to Nezu's office. The school felt empty, as the students had been given 2 days off to recover from the sports festival, which also gave hero agencies an opportunity to organize their information and submit any expressions of interest for work placement students. But Izuku was on school grounds now, because Nezu had asked him to come in. While the day off would have been nice, he couldn't refuse a direct request from the principal. When he got there, knocking on the door and receiving a cheery "come in," Nezu was sitting at his desk, and Aizawa was leaning against a wall to the side. He listened silently as Nezu spoke about the festival, and apologized for the choice he'd made. It was nice of him, but as he elaborated on knowing that Izuku had problems with discrimination before now, and the trust issues to go with it, which made Nezu genuinely sorry with the outcome, Izuku zoned out. He'd had a couple of teachers like this, mostly during elementary school. Luckily, Nezu didn't treat him like glass like those teachers had. But they both did the same thing. Apologized and explained how they thought the world worked, while never fixing the problem. Nezu went deep into the politics of his decision, outlining every step and thought chain he went through because he claimed he wanted to be transparent about things, because that was what you deserve. But Izuku already understood. He'd always understood. To be quirkless was to be picked last, if you were ever picked at all. Being left behind even if you were better than the rest, and fighting for everything you have. As an analyst, he could understand the decisions Nezu made and the possible problems and benefits that came from his choice. But he'd been stupid enough to forget that Nezu would be playing the long game, and would always pick the school and its reputation over him. And he'd gotten hurt by that choice because of it. Loopholes, like the one he'd used about not bringing anything from outside the arena in, could easily be seen as cheating. The rock that was part of the arena from Uraraka and Bakugo's fight, and a part of his shirt were things that were already there, so he wasn't bringing anything in, but he was bringing in objects fashioned in a way that could be seen as a tool, which was not allowed. If he'd had an analysis quirk, then maybe the match would have been called in his favor, a smart if unexpected victory. But when it was revealed that he was quirkless, he'd been called a cheat and much, much worse. Quirkless people don't win, and if they do, they must have tricked their way into it. Aizawa and President Mike had done the best to control the crowds, had defended him, but there was only so much they could do against society itself, and so Nezu had been called in from the third-year arena to call the results of the match. Aizawa was silent now. He didn't speak up once while Nezu gave his monologue. He was like a statue, unmoving, just leaning against the wall. Izuku nodded in the right places, and kept his replies to a minimum, until Nezu finally let him leave. He stood up, bowed, and left, Aizawa finally moving from his place on the wall to follow him out. They walked down a couple of corridors before Aizawa stopped him gently, just a touch to the arm. Izuku turned with a question on his tongue, only for it to be forgotten as he was wrapped in a hug. Before he could question what his gruff underground hero and teacher was doing, Aizawa spoke. "I'm sorry." The words were quiet, but Izuku could hear them clearly from their close proximity. "You're stronger than all of them, Midoriya, and one day they'll have to see that. And I'm going to do my best to fight for you, but that doesn't mean I'm going to win. I'm not exactly powerful or influential, and have little say in these big-scale politics. Just hang on a bit longer, and you'll be able to give them hell." Izuku had just been given a painful reminder to be careful with who he trusted, but standing in that empty hallway, he couldn't find it in himself to dismiss Aizawa. Not when he'd been the first person to believe in him, not when he'd been the one to tell him what he'd gone through wasn't okay, and it was all right to acknowledge that, and to grow past it. The scarred and forgotten parts of him wanted to retreat in himself more to avoid the chance of more pain, but instead, he took the offered comfort, clinging onto Aizawa's jumpsuit, and cried quietly. His tears were angry and hurt, falling for justice that he'd never get, for opportunities that would pass him by. He'd been reminded he had to be careful with who he trusted, and that he was fighting for the bare minimum, but the fact that he was in UA, being supported through his tears and sniffles, made it easier to believe it would be worth it. Because it would be worth it, even if it hurt now. Katsuki kicked at the dust and dirt he had gathered near the stairs of the apartment complex. He'd asked Auntie Inko where Deku was, and she said out, though he'd be home soon. So Katsuki had stuck around, but hadn't accepted her invitation to wait inside. He had things he needed to say to Deku, and he wanted a proper conversation, and that meant no interruptions. Sure enough, a couple minutes later and a green head of hair came walking up. In the past, Deku would have kept walking, head down, shoulders hunched, and muttering some garbage to himself. But now he just looked tired as he paused outside of Katsuki's reach. "We need to talk." He pushed off the wall, walking past the nerd. Despite all the changes he'd been through, the sound of his feet on pavement, trailing behind Katsuki like a lost puppy, hadn't changed. How long had it been since he'd actually followed Katsuki, though? What had finally made him stop? Deku didn't say anything, though, didn't try to catch up. He just followed. Katsuki waited to see if anything would change, but by the time they'd reached a small park that the two of them had once gone to nearly every day, still hadn't said anything. Of course, Katsuki would have to do all the fucking work. "Why the hell are you still trying, Deku? You're never going to become a hero." He'd left Deku to deal with his own shit when he'd been acting weird in middle school, and kept watching and waiting for the trick when he showed up at fucking UA, but he'd reached his limit, and he wanted answers. Deku just looked at him, with bags under his eyes, and shrugged. "I have people who believe in me now, Kachan." And of course, he was still using that stupid nickname, just to make his useless, flat answer more infuriating. "Why can't you believe in me?" "Because you're a useless, shitty Deku. All you do is run from things and cry. How the hell are you meant to be a hero when the only thing that makes you special is the fact that you're fucking not? There's nothing you can do to get better than anyone else. You've always been trailing behind everyone else, and if you somehow trick your dumbass into getting a license, then you're just going to get people killed because you can't do shit." He paused to look for any signs of reaction, any weak, muttered protest, but Deku just stood there. Except it wasn't his usual tense, scared quiet. Deku wasn't relaxed, and hadn't let Katsuki leave his sight, but he didn't seem scared anymore. And it wasn't because he was blank and unseeing either. He was just Deku, tired and standing in an empty park after following Katsuki there like he'd done so many times before. Even as the silence continued, he didn't speak up, just looking at him, being blank and useless. Katsuki's hands twitched until he let off some small explosions, along with a shout of frustration. "Stop with all your bullshit and just tell me why, you damn nerd." And Deku just shrugged again. "Because I want to." Katsuki's eyes narrowed as he let off another explosion and stomped towards the nerd, ready to grab him and shake some real answers out of him. But he only got 2 steps closer before Deku was on the other side of the park, and looking to run at a second's notice. "I don't know what else you want from me, Kachan. I've always wanted to be a hero. We wanted to be heroes together, and I'm not going to let being quirkless stop me, no matter what anyone else says or does. Because it would be the same anywhere else, so I might as well try to follow a dream." Deku's posture hadn't changed, always ready to run, something that hadn't changed in the years Katsuki had known him. But something about Deku felt bigger than the tiny frame across from him. It made Katsuki stare, and stopped him from following and demanding more answers from Deku as he turned and left. Pretty much everyone, Katsuki knew, had told Deku to stop trying. They told him to be realistic, and some, including himself, had tried to bring him to reality by knocking him around. After all, that seemed like the only way to get some fucking sense into the thick skull of his. Once, at the very edge of Katsuki's memory, they had said they would be heroes together. Before his quirk came in, and Deku's didn't, they made all sorts of plans. Of course, Katsuki was going to be number 1, but Deku was going to be right there behind him like always. There was no place for a quirkless hero in the rankings, so he dropped Deku out of any of his thoughts about heroics. Yet, if Deku hadn't been disqualified, he would have been right next to Katsuki in second place. The pebble was catching up. That was why he needed answers, but Deku was fucking gone now, and Katsuki was left in an empty fucking park, trying to understand how Deku could keep going, with the world telling him he was worthless. How could he just ignore that? How was he so good at proving them wrong? The trains were packed on the first day back. They usually were this time of day, but with the rain pouring outside, people who usually walked or rode to their destinations had opted to take public transport. That usually wasn't a problem for Izuku. He was small enough to fit in and aware enough to not get crushed, most of the time at least. But today, he was in his UA uniform, and 2 days was nowhere near long enough for people to forget his face. It started off simple. "Hey, are you from UA?" And he couldn't really deny it in full uniform. Then, "Are you really quirkless?" From there, it had only gotten worse. People crowding him, shoving him around, talking down to him, and shouting questions. He'd ended up having to get off at an earlier stop to switch trains. He made sure to cover his hair and lower face with a scarf before he got on to avoid a similar reaction. Several months of running around villain attacks and disaster sites had taught him that being able to obscure your identity or having some basic air filter was incredibly useful, which meant he now always carried a scarf with him. It might stand out as unusual wrapped around his lower face, but with the varying nature of quirks, no one would question it too much. By the time he made it to class, he was wet, having forgotten his umbrella, and irritated. His irritation only grew hearing the rest of his classmates talk about their trips to school, the kind words said to them, the encouragement, the praise. He kept his bitterness contained with the ease of practice, but the why of it all wouldn't leave his brain. It was only when Aizawa walked in and began talking about the work experience week drafts that it faded. Aizawa handed out the stacks of offers to several members of the class, from the mountain of paper that Todoroki and Bakugo received to the single page that landed on Izuku's desk, along with a note to see Nezu during lunch, right beside the standard 40 agencies that were offered to all students. He'd expected to get some offers, having gotten to the final round, but just as he'd predicted, they were all out of pity, or so they could use him as a public relations stunt. The noise rose as the class began to talk amongst themselves about the offers, including Shinso, who tapped his shoulder to get his attention. "Who do you think I should go for?" Shinso was looking at the standard sheet with a hint of worry. "I'm not sure. It depends on what you're looking for in the experience, I guess." Shinso nodded before looking up at Izuku. "Who are you going to go with?" "I'm not sure yet. I'll need to do some research before I decide." Izuku knew who he wanted to go with, but his offer wouldn't be on the page he'd been given. Izuku still had to confirm the last of his predictions. But if he couldn't work with Sir Night-Eye, he wasn't sure who he would choose. It didn't help that on the standard sheet, several agencies, more than half, but those were good odds when it came to him, had been crossed out. They'd refused to take him. Whether it was because he was a cheat or because he was quirkless, they had singled him out as the student they refused to work with. Izuku found himself looking up towards Aizawa and caught him watching him from the corner of his eye. So he just shrugged and gave a twisted smile. That irritation from his morning had combined with his anger at the world, and it seethed under his skin, but that was no reason to worry Aizawa, especially not when he had seen this coming. "Now, while it's important to think about your drafts, the hero informatics period isn't actually about them. Today you'll be coming up with your hero names." It was a pretty big sign of respect that the class didn't immediately burst into excited shouts, given that this was one of the aspects that hero hopefuls often dreamed about. "Your hero names are important and can shape your future image. I don't care about that sort of stuff, so—" "I'll be evaluating your hero names." Midnight kicked open the door of the classroom, marching in with vigor. "Make sure you choose wisely, kids. Even though you'll have chances to change your hero names before you get your license, they might stick around before then." She slammed down a pile of whiteboards onto the podium. "Everyone will write down their hero name on a whiteboard, and you'll have 15 minutes to do so." As the whiteboards were handed out, Izuku thought back to the ideas he'd had when he was little. He'd had a lot of fun coming up with them, but considering they all had something to do with All Might, he didn't think he could use any of them now. When Midnight called time and asked them to come up and present their ideas, Izuku's board was still blank. He didn't seem to be the only one having trouble, though, given the pen tapping nervously on the desk behind him, and the metaphorical smoke coming off of Ida across the room. He wasn't paying much attention to the names being presented as he tried to come up with his own before it was too late, though he did speak up at Midnight's dismissal of Alien Queen. Not everyone would know the reference to a terrifying monster, so it worked given Ashido's mutated appearance and her acid abilities, plus, for those who did know the reference, it made her all the more intimidating. There was a hero just walking the streets called Death Arms. Why couldn't there be an Alien Queen, especially when it could be shortened to Ailey or Queen for a more friendly appeal? There had been silence for a second before Ashido had yelled, "Hell yeah!" and ran to give him a high five, firmly telling Midnight that she was never changing her hero name now. Midnight had just sighed about the passion of youth before moving on, while the class laughed at Ashido's reaction. Izuku thought about that reaction, and the reactions he'd been getting online and in person now that everyone knew he was quirkless, and in UA's heroics course. What did being a hero mean to him? He knew he wanted to save people, he always had, but it was also about being here, moving forward, defying every statistic and comment and expectation because that was all he had. He could be feeling biased right now, with the anger and hurt still close to the surface, with questions unanswered because no one could truly tell him why someone quirkless couldn't be a hero, but it all had to mean something. When Midnight called on him for his name, he'd just finished scribbling it out. The whole class had eyes on him, but he couldn't bring himself to feel nervous when he flipped the board around. Midnight hesitated for a moment before speaking up. "That's a fairly confrontational name, Midoriya. Are you sure?" Izuku nodded. "No matter what name I pick, someone's going to have a problem with it. Besides, they're already saying stuff like this online. Might as well embrace it and try to turn it into something positive." He smiled as he walked away from the podium. He got some words of support from his classmates as he sat at his desk, board placed in front of him. The defiant hero, Kakume, who said revolutions were always a bad thing. At least the name wasn't as violent as Lord Explosion Murder. It was clever wordplay, but Izuku agreed with Midnight's opinion that it wasn't a good hero name. By the end of the lesson, Bakugo was the only one who still didn't have a hero name, though there were definitely a couple that needed improvement. Izuku promised Ida and Shinso he'd help them with their ideas, who'd both panicked and written names that revolved around their quirks, choosing engine and control, respectively, as soon as he got back from his lunch errand. What the errand was going to entail was a bit of a mystery, though. Izuku had recently spoken to Nezu, and their lessons were usually in the afternoon, so he didn't know why he'd want to see him. He knocked on the principal's door and entered, finding Nezu staring at his computer screen intently as he typed. "Ah, Midoriya, thank you for coming. I hope you're doing well." Izuku nodded as Nezu finally glanced up at him. "That's good. There's not much I needed to discuss with you today. In fact, I believe it is others that want to contact you. These," he said, pushing forward a stack of papers towards him, "are for you. I haven't read through them, as they were addressed to you, but be wary of their contents. They were all sent through official channels, so they're not random letters from the public, but that does not mean they will be nice. Do with them what you will." Izuku grabbed the pile of letters and placed them into his bag, before thanking Nezu and leaving. He was pretty sure a couple of these would be from heroes he had asked his question to in the past, probably wondering what the hell he was doing. As the day passed, he found his mind drifting to the letters and what kind of content they'd have. Worst case scenario, they were all hateful and filled with threats, but that meant that reading them wouldn't be too different from reading some of the published articles and comments that had been made about him. And he had only been skimming those, along with a few that had popped up in the forums he was in. His forum had been pretty nice about it. Sure, there were a lot of people who didn't understand, but others had brought forward successful heroes that had non-combative quirks, and unknowingly wished him luck. It had made him smile. His friends also made him smile. Uraraka decided immediately that she would go with Gunhead for her work experience, which was unexpected, but a great choice. Ida was going to go with his brother, though as soon as he told him, he'd promised Izuku that, in their second year, he'd choose someone else to help diversify his skills. Shinso was still undecided, though he was considering joining Uraraka at Gunhead's agency, as it would be a good place to gain a basic martial skill set. They'd been talking around Izuku's desk about other possible options at the end of the day when someone stopped by their group. Todoroki had his hands full with his offers, though it wasn't all of them. The others were probably taking up all the free room in his bag. "Midoriya, who would you recommend interning with?" The whole group turned to look at the unexpected guest, Shinso and Uraraka's eyebrows near flying off their faces with the question. "You seem to know a lot about many heroes. Is that related to your question thing?" That question made everyone stiffen, including Izuku. "Not really." He fidgeted with the straps of the bag in his lap. "I've been researching heroes long before I started my, question thing. I love them, and I guess I know some more in-depth stuff on heroes I tracked down, but I always wanted to know as much about heroes as possible, so..." He trailed off, unsure how to finish his statement. Todoroki seemed to find it satisfying enough, nodding as if he didn't realize what a huge social blunder he'd just made. No one in the class ever really brought up what he'd admitted at the USJ, and for that Izuku was grateful. "So, do you know who would suit me, then?" "What, couldn't find anyone you'd like in your mountain of offers?" Shinso scoffed. Izuku appreciated Shinso's effort to get Todoroki to back off, but he was pretty sure the heterochromatic boy really did want the help. "Well, Not every hero who puts in an offer is best suited for teaching. Some of them probably just want Todoroki because he's Endeavor's son, which is stupid. Todoroki is his own person with a completely different skill set and quirk, so there's definitely a lot he has to look out for in who he chooses. He put a hand to his chin, trying to think of who would best suit Todoroki before he realized that it would be better to let him have some agency in the choice. Firstly, you should start by thinking of what you want from this internship. What do you want to learn? Do you want to improve something you already have, or do you want to learn something new and diversify? Todoroki blinked at him, which Izuku was beginning to believe was how he showed emotion. I'm not sure. Izuku paused, considering his words. Focus on fire. You need it. He had been angry and sad and empty when he'd told Todoroki to use his fire, hadn't been able to see how his past could hinder him from using a power that Izuku would have died to have, but now, after several days, what Todoroki had said had sunk in, and it made Izuku despise the number 2 hero, so he felt some regret when suggesting to use the power that Todoroki associated with his abuser, but if he was going to go into such a dangerous field, then he'd need his fire, and that wasn't even touching on the mental benefits of getting rid of the association of his quirk with endeavors. Your control isn't the best, but with a bit of training you should be able to get the hang of it quickly, especially since you can use your ice to temper it. You could probably even learn how to create explosions if you rapidly cooled then heated the air around you, though the explosion would also affect you. Izuku stopped before he could ramble further about Todoroki's quirk and give unsolicited advice. Todoroki blinked at him again, frowning a tiny fraction. Okay. Thank you for the advice. And with that he left, falling in step with Yaoyorozu and Jiro as they all finished their day. Well, that was unexpected. Ida nodded at Shinzo's statement. Indeed, Todoroki did not strike me as the type to ask for advice. He did come to the right person about it. Midoriya, you better watch out or the whole class is going to swarm you for advice again. Uraraka seemed genuinely concerned, but Izuku could only laugh at that. If he'd told a younger version of himself that people would willingly come to him for advice, he'd have thought he'd started hallucinating. You say that as if we aren't monopolizing the shit out of his advice already. Shinzo stood, swinging his bag onto his shoulder, after packing away the last of his stuff. With Shinzo ready, they all grabbed their bags and started the walk to the nearby train station. They were just outside the UA gates, Uraraka asking for ways to modify the regime Izuku had given her to work with the work experience week schedule, when Izuku heard someone shout his name. He turned towards the sound, not recognizing anyone he knew at first, until a couple started waving at him. Do you know those people, Midoriya? Ida was right beside him, standing tall and protective. Izuku was about to say he didn't until the taller of the two looked down at her partner, and recognition sparked. Yeah, I do. It had been months since he'd seen them, but Satsuki had been looking down at Haru every time he'd turned his head to check on how she was doing as they made their way down the landslide, and despite everything that had happened that day, he hadn't forgotten the two of them. I'll be one moment, sorry. He didn't give them any other explanation as he made his way over to the two women, as he was still unsure as to why the couple would be here. Satsuki waved again as he stepped in front of them, almost bouncing in place. Hey! His greeting was much less enthusiastic, though it was nice to see her not probably concussed. Hi. She smiled. I'm so sorry to track you down like this. There is nothing creepier than a whole-ass adult waiting outside of school to talk to a kid, Haru quickly added in. Yeah, but we never got to say thank you for what you did at the landslide. Izuku took a moment to process their combined words before trying to brush them off. Oh, you don't need to thank me for that. He'd spent so much time wandering that day, just looking for victims of the landslide, he'd never considered anyone would care what he'd done. I was just helping. Satsuki's expression became more serious at that, taking a step closer as she began to speak. Midoriya, you probably saved my life. As much as she'd like to, Haru can't carry me, and we never would have made it down the mountain without you. At least, not before my head trauma knocked me out and slowly killed me. If you hadn't been there, our only other chance would have been if another hero had stumbled upon us, and there's no telling when that would have happened. We tried to track you down once Satsuki was better again, but no one knew who we were talking about when we described you. All the rescue and emergency personnel didn't know who you were, though a few said they'd seen you. Haru laughed, looking between Satsuki and Izuku. We didn't even have a name. So imagine our surprise when we see our hero running like a bat out of hell during the UA Sports Festival of all things. Izuku's heart did something strange at the way Satsuki said our hero. His anger from earlier in the day a distant memory in the face of their words. Satsuki is the love of my life, and it's thanks to you that she's still around. He was about to speak out against that, but Haru continued before he let out a sound. No, don't say anything. No what-ifs, buts, or maybes. You were the one who helped us that day, and got us to that hero, and down the mountain. So we both needed to say thank you in person. I know this is probably unexpected, and maybe unwelcome with the amount of attention you've been getting. She looked around at that, as if the media was going to swarm him and tell him he was a waste of space right in front of them. But it was important to us, for you to know that you're a hero, quirk or no quirk, she beamed, completely unaware of the internal storm of emotions she was causing. And that kind of works in our favor, I guess, since we got you a gift to show our appreciation before we gave up on finding you. You... what? Izuku didn't think he was properly processing the conversation anymore. Haru placed a hand on Satsuki's arm, calming the slight bounce that had returned. You don't have to accept it. We didn't know who you were, but we guessed you'd want something useful since you seemed so level-headed in a disaster. She paused, bringing a small package out of the pocket that was hidden in her skirt. It's a multi-tool, small enough to fit in a bag or pocket, but like I said, please don't feel pressured to accept it. Satsuki may have gotten a bit overexcited at the idea of tracking you down to say thanks. She looked up at her partner at that, serious expression breaking into a small smile for a moment. No, I'd love it. It felt unreal, as she presented him with the little package complete with a string bow. He ran his fingertips over the paper, as if to convince himself it was real, that all this was. Thank you. That's our line. Haru elbowed Satsuki, who just pouted. We'll let you get back to your friends, but seriously, thank you. Don't let anything they say bring you down. You're going to be a great hero. You already are to us. They said their goodbyes to each other after that, leaving Izuku to walk back to where his friends were waiting in a daze. They were the first people he'd saved that had thanked him. Shinso had thanked him for his help with the entrance exam, but he'd saved them. He found himself holding back tears as he rejoined his friends. Of course, they immediately asked him who the couple was, so he gave them a basic explanation of what had happened, in the least worrying way possible. As he spoke, a few tears slipped out. He was walking with his friends, away from the hero school he attended, after being thanked and called a hero by someone he'd saved. Of course, because he was crying, everyone triple-checked he was fine before they separated at the station, and he wasn't lying when he told them they were happy tears. That happiness dimmed a bit when he dragged the scarf out of his bag to cover his features once again, and the still unopened package joined the letters. He could have skipped having to do this by getting home on foot, but he wanted to get through the letters tonight along with everything else he had to do, and he was sick of being pushed out of spaces when he'd done nothing wrong. His afternoon was spent reading. There were more important things he could have started with, but he'd wanted to know what was in those letters since Nezu had given them to him. There was a fair amount of variation between each letter. A few were from people who were abusing their connection with heroes just to send him mail about how much a waste he was in the hero course, but the rest all came from hero agencies. Random staff members, sidekicks, and heroes themselves had written letters to him. Of course, that didn't change the fact that a lot of them were in the same vein of questioning and unpleasant, calling for him to leave the heroic course and UA in general. But there were a few that stood out. The most notable was probably from Hawks. Izuku honestly didn't think the hero would have remembered him, not with such a crazy schedule and high position within the rankings. His letter even mentioned the work placements and how his agency had only one opening, and he had been advised to pick someone suitable for the face of the agency, written with many, many quotation marks, and that they didn't consider a disqualified quirkless kid as that face. But that didn't change the fact that he wanted to support Izuku, so there was a number written at the bottom of the letter, a tiny note asking for Izuku to not spread it around, squeezed underneath it. At that point, Izuku would have expected the letter to be a hoax if it weren't for the fact that preceding the phone number was a note saying, "You can use this instead of jumping off any roofs if you need my attention." With such a specific reference to their meeting, Izuku's doubt faded enough for him to put the number in his phone to test later. That letter stayed in the forefront of his mind as he went through the others until he reached one with scrawled handwriting he could recognize. It matched a signature spanning 2 pages of a waterlogged and burnt notebook that lay somewhere in his shelves. It was an apology. For words said over a year ago, without enough thought put into them and followed by regret. It was also a promise that when Izuku was ready to talk, All Might would be waiting, and that he hoped that he could one day give Izuku some tips on becoming a hero. Izuku carefully refolded that letter and put it right next to the one from Hawks. then continued to read the others. It was emotionally draining to read through them, but some of them were genuine encouragement. Those ones were nice. After the day he'd had, he didn't have a lot of energy left to feel either way about the pile that now sat on his desk. So instead of thinking about them, he turned to his computer and began composing his final email to Sir Night-Eye. He'd predicted each event of the sports festival, the contents of those events, who the winners would be with 2 possible backup options, and, all in explicit terms, just as asked. He'd spent hours on those predictions, and then had to build further on them by predicting how the rest of the hero community would react given those outcomes. And now, having seen the work experience offers given to the others alongside his own, he could report back to Sir Night-Eye and let him know that he'd been right. He'd sent it after rereading it a dozen times, hoping that it would be enough. That night, he went to bed feeling conflicted. He'd felt so angry today, sad and forgotten too. Then he'd also felt happy, surrounded by friends and praised for his work. He was recognized as some sort of personal hero, as an analyst his classmates could rely on, but he'd also been recognized as the quirkless cheat from the sports festival. He'd been told he was worthless even though he could see his actions had weight and worth. He was only able to escape the confusing spiral when his brain finally worked its way into exhaustion, and sleep overcame him. His second day back after the sports festival started similarly, hiding away on the train and ignoring the articles about the event. The rest progressed normally, chatting with his classmates and keeping up with lesson content until lunch. Lunch had only just begun when 3 students made their way into the classroom. Their uniforms indicated they were also in the hero course, though they were definitely in the upper years. They walked straight across the room, the blonde one leading with a little waving and excusing as they wove around the other students, stopping right in front of Izuku's desk. Everyone still in the classroom, which was most of them considering the lunch bell had only just rung, watched on, stunned. "Hello, my name is Toga Mirio. This is Nejiri and Tamaki, who don't really need to be here, but they were curious about you, so I couldn't just leave them behind." "Hello?" He didn't even have a buffer of his friends this time, only Shinzo behind him. "Right, you're probably wondering why I'm here." He reached into his pocket before presenting Izuku with a slip of paper. "Technically a day late, but I hope you'll consider Sir's offer. You must be doing something right to have grabbed his attention." And like a switch had been flipped, Togata was gone, his field of vision replaced with Nejiri. "Do you think it was because you're quirkless? You are really quirkless, right? How does that feel?" He shrunk away from her questions, but that didn't seem to deter her. "Do people usually get so mad at you for winning competitions, or was that just because it's a sports festival? Where'd you learn to use a sling? Is that what you're going to use to try and be a hero? Why do you want to be a hero if you don't have a quirk?" She was practically touching his face at that point, but thankfully Togata chimed in then, pulling her away for a moment. "Sorry about that. You don't have to worry about answering any of those questions." Izuku blinked, still running through the questions and the answers he would have given. "That's all right." He gave Togata and Nejiri a tentative smile. "I kind of understand. I mutter a lot. I can't imagine what I would be like if I had self-confidence." That got a slight laugh out of the dark-haired boy who'd yet to say anything, and earned him another huge smile from Togata. "Well, I hope you decide to join me at Sir Night-Eye's agency, Midoriya." He turned, trailed by Tamaki, and with a hand on Nejiri's uniform to drag her away from where she'd been questioning Hagakure. "I'll see you there." And with that, they were gone. Izuku looked at the small slip of paper in his hand, and felt the biggest sense of relief as he held the proof that his ridiculous plan had worked. He was able to enjoy the freeing feeling for a whole 2 seconds before the class turned and bombarded him with questions on what the hell had just happened. While they didn't get the answers they wanted, they were left with the sense that Izuku had put far too much effort into the work placements before the sports festival had even started, because he hadn't believed anyone would truly want a quirkless intern. And he'd been right. He'd been asking why for so long. While it had only been a bit over a year since he'd started actively asking the question, why had been a question that had plagued him. Why was he quirkless? Why didn't he have friends? Why did his teachers hate him? Why did Bakugo hurt him? Why was he worthless? Why couldn't he be a hero? He was thinking of that question again as the people at the train station watched their group, 1A organizing their luggage, figuring out which trains they'd be taking. It reminded him of that first train back after the sports festival, everyone watching and taking that opportunity to question him, to put him down. It had taken him a while, but in that moment he realized something. He was in UA's heroics course, costume in hand, about to leave to go on a work placement with a pro hero who would actually help him. His friends were wishing him luck and asking for last-minute advice, and they didn't care that he was quirkless. So when he got onto the train to Sir Night-Eye's agency, he didn't bother ducking down or trying to hide his face. He didn't need to ask why anymore. He was done with asking questions, looking for opinions from people who had already decided to hate him. He was going to be a hero. He knew he was going to have to fight every step of the way, but that wasn't any different from every other day of his life. It's why he chose this path over the easier routes he could have taken. Izuku stepped onto a train and grabbed onto his rebuilt dream with both hands, holding it tightly instead of letting the broken, desperate parts of his brain cling with whatever they had left. There had been many times over his life when he'd lied to himself and said he could make it as a hero. Recently, after blood, sweat, and tears, he'd made others believe it was true. And for the first time, he believed it too. Izuku was going to be a hero, and nothing could stop him. All right, listeners, this concludes the last fic in the Frequently Asked Questions series. This was When One Thing Ends, Another Can Begin. I adore this series a lot. I hope you all enjoyed it as well. If you have an opportunity, if you like the series, and you get a chance to slide over to AO3 to leave comments and kudos to the original author, I'm sure it'll be much appreciated. Again, this is the final chapter, final fic in this 3-fic series that we've done for this one, so I really like what the author did with it. It was incredibly well done. I feel like it wraps it up really well. There were a lot of changes throughout it, like the events with Stain don't happen and Genium doesn't get attacked because Stain walks away. There's a lot of things that occur differently because of it. Izuku going to intern with Night-Eye right off the bat. So I think the author did an incredible job with this. I'm eager to hear what you all thought about it as well. And as always, thank you so much for listening.